Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. A man who is at the very forefront of fighting that war, certainly intellectually and in terms of his policy counsel, is our first guest. He is Ambassador John Bolton. He formerly represented the United States at the United Nations, also served in myriad other capacities at the senior levels of the United States government, notably in the State Department, the Justice Department, and elsewhere. He is always welcome here. Today, he is calling us from the American Enterprise Institute, where he is a senior fellow. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back. Great to have you with us, as always.
Glad to be with you, Frank. Thanks for having me.
You have been mincing no words about the deal that President Obama has been desperately seeking to strike with the Iranians. In fact, you described it at a recent event we had together in South Carolina as an unprecedented surrender. Describe what makes it so and what the implications might be.
Well, unfortunately, what the president has done in his effort to reach some kind of deal with Iran is conceded elements of the parts of a nuclear weapons program that successive resolutions of the UN Security Council have insisted that they give up, so that the American position going in has been weaker than what China and Russia accepted 6, 7, 8 years ago. And what that means from Iran's point of view is that they are making trivial, easily reversible concessions. They've won the big issue, and now they're just simply going through some blue smoke and mirrors exercises to get the economic sanctions lifted. I have no doubt that they have not changed their strategic resolve to get nuclear weapons, a policy they've been pursuing for 30 years, and that they think they've taken America as far as they can get it. And that's why ultimately there'll be a deal, because it's so much more in Iran's interest than in ours.
Yeah. You've not only been a practitioner of diplomacy at the highest levels, but I think you're a pretty serious student of history as well. The comparison between what Obama is doing and what the former Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, did with the Nazis springs to mind and is often used. In a way, it seems to me that does a disservice to Chamberlain, that what we're dealing with here is appeasement of the worst kind in the face of direct threats to this country that continue. Talk about that, if you would, please, Mr. Ambassador.
No, I think it's a signal to Iran and to our adversaries all around the world that they face in the Obama administration somebody who's just not serious about national security. And it's going to have ramifications not just with respect to the Iranian program, but in areas of the world where people who don't have our best interests at heart are following these negotiations very carefully. And look, it is appeasement. There's simply no other way to describe it. When you concede the fundamentals of the other side's position in the expectation that that will satisfy them, that they will say, okay, now that we've got that, we'll be peace-loving, we'll give up our role as the world's central banker of international terrorism, we'll renounce our nuclear weapons ambitions. It's delusional. It would be a kind of interesting fiction if it weren't so threatening to the United States and Israel and our Arab friends.
You have described in several places your conviction that this really does constitute a mortal threat to the United States and requires military action to disrupt this nuclear program. As you say, it's been underway for years. Unfortunately, we've allowed it to continue to this point. I'm wondering whether, in particular, in light of revelations that the Iranians have made apparently in some 20 places in their military doctrine reference to the use of electromagnetic pulse against the United States, that this doesn't really constitute an absolute necessity at this point, not something that is just a bit of gratuitous policy advice from somebody out of power at the moment.
No, I think we are directly at risk from the Iranian program. I think the threat of an EMP attack is very real. They don't need the ballistic missile capability, which they may not have yet, although their North Korean friends are certainly close to it. They can put a nuclear device on a tramp steamer or put it on the top of a primitive Scud missile, sail the tramp steamer into any harbor in the United States, shoot it up 1,000 feet, and it could have a dramatic impact all across the United States or Europe or whatever target they went after. And it would not necessarily be easily traceable to Iran. Actually, ballistic missiles are easier to back azimuth than a terrorist attack like the one I've described. So it is a threat to Israel. It is a threat to the Saudis and other Arab friends. It's a threat to us, too. The president doesn't take it seriously. And it's just amazing to me that we haven't been able to make this more of a political issue. I know you're trying. I know I'm trying. We all need to try more. It goes to the safety of our country.
Well, whether it's a political issue, it certainly is a policy issue, and we ought to be making clear that there is an alternative approach, and you're doing your level best at that. One last question on this. Again, Mr. Ambassador, you've spent most of your professional life working in one aspect or another of national security policy, to your great credit, and I think to the country's great benefit. Specifically, what are the implications for proliferation if this deal, constructed as it seems now to be, allowing essentially the full nuclear fuel cycle to be in the hands of a proliferating regime, were to be applied more broadly?
Well, I think the proliferation implications are very grave, and in fact, I think the implications have already begun to turn into reality. I think the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Turks, and others have watched the Obama administration over 2 years demonstrate by one concession after another that they're not going to do what's necessary to stop the Iranians, and the Saudis and the others have concluded that when the president says all options are on the table, he doesn't mean it. Certainly the Iranians don't think he means it. So I think the proliferation, the arms race in the Middle East on the nuclear side has already begun, unfortunately, and I think it will spread elsewhere as well. That's why I have focused so much on the past 15 years in stopping Iran, because it's not only the Iranian threat, it's the inevitable onward proliferation effect. And as I say, I'm worried that's already begun. So when we get hopefully a real president in 2 years, the options that new president faces are going to be very limited if we're not careful.
Yeah. We'll be talking more about this with guests in the subsequent segments, but I couldn't agree with you more about your concern that it is underway already. Let me turn to another topic in which you've expressed very grave concerns about the administration's policy. And again, our guest is Ambassador John Bolton, the author of Surrender is Not an Option. You frequently find his writings in all the right places and see him, of course, at Fox with great regularity. Israel and the conduct of this administration towards it in so many different respects, but I'd like particularly to ask you what your thoughts are about how the administration's threats to essentially accede to Israel's enemies at the United Nations is likely to translate into circumstances there, for one thing, and for the security of Israel, much more importantly.
Well, it's a very real threat and a very serious one. You know, this is a case where, unlike many others, where what happens at the United Nations actually makes a difference. And from Israel's point of view, it's pure risk all the way around. If the president stands back and does not perform America's typical role of casting a veto against hostile, anti-Israel resolutions, I think the Security Council would overwhelmingly vote to recognize Palestine as a state within the 67 limits. That would end diplomacy as we know it. It would be an immediate threat to peace and security in the region. It would expose Israel to prosecutions in the International Criminal Court. By the way, quote-unquote, Palestine joins the court today. And it would mean, I think, that the Israelis would be at risk from all manner of other resolutions across the UN system that would leave it in very great peril. And the notion that we would simply abandon our role on Israel, I think, would be a horrible signal to friends around the world as well. So this is something that I think Israel needs to worry about, and even beyond the UN. You know, the president's remarks about Netanyahu basically threatening Israeli democracy by his concern of efforts by leftists from the United States and maybe even U.S. tax dollars to turn out the anti-Netanyahu vote really goes to questioning the legitimacy of Israel itself. And, you know, I think we're perilously close, from what Obama himself said, certainly from what many others say, to slip back into the days when the UN General Assembly said that Zionism was a form of racism. But the president has acted in an absolutely irresponsible way, directly contrary to core American interest, and I don't think we've seen the end of it, unfortunately.
I'm afraid you're right. You, of course, were instrumental in getting that resolution describing Zionism as racism repealed. Mr. Ambassador, we salute you for that, and again, deeply appreciate the clarity with which you are addressing these vital interests of not just our friends and allies around the world, but of our own people as well. Keep up the great work at the American Enterprise Institute and Fox and elsewhere, and come back to us again if you would very soon. Next up, Walid Phares. We'll take stock with him of the regional sectarian war now underway. Straight ahead.